So let's shift gears now and talk about where we're headed. And let me focus first on the battlefield. And when I focus on the battlefield, I'll pick up from where I just left off, talking about the present situation on the battlefield. I'll talk about the future situation. And this is where I'll make the case that the Russians are going to win this war. This is, as I said, a war of attrition. It bears more resemblance to World War I than it does to World War II. And who wins a war of attrition is a function of three factors: the balance of resolve, the population size of the adversaries, and the amount of artillery that each side has. It's very important to understand that artillery is the main weapon when you're fighting a war of attrition. When I was in the Army, and then when I went to West Point, it was impressed upon us that artillery is the king of battle. And when you get into a fight like the Ukrainians and the Russians are now engaged in, the casualty exchange ratio is largely a function of the artillery on each side. So you want to ask yourself, as we think about this conflict, what does the balance of resolve look like? What do the population figures look like? And what does the balance of artillery look like? Because the balance of artillery tells you a great deal about casualty exchange ratios, which obviously matter greatly in a war like this. All right, start with resolve. In terms of resolve, I don't think there's any meaningful difference. Obviously, the Ukrainians are resolved to win this one and to get back their territory. Completely understandable. And obviously, the Russians are resolved to win this one and settle this conflict as best they can on favorable terms. And given that they think they see an existential threat facing them, their resolve is great. So I don't see any meaningful difference in the balance of resolve. What about the balance of population? Going into the war, the Ukrainians had far less people than the Russians. The balance was 3.5 to 1 going into the war. There were 3.5 Russians for every Ukrainian. Today, I believe there are 5 Russians for every 1 Ukrainian. You just want to think about that. 5 to 1 imbalance. You all understand that 8 million Ukrainians have left the country. 3 million have gone to Russia. And that 3.5 to 1 ratio that I gave you was based on the assumption that those Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in the Donbass counted as part of the Ukrainian population. They're now counted as part of the Russian population. I could go on and on about the numbers, but I think 5 to 1 is a good ratio to explain where we are at today. And this is bad news for the Ukrainians. Then we come to the artillery imbalance. Almost all of the reports on that balance say the number is either 5 to 1, 7 to 1, or maybe 10 to 1 in the Russians' favor. This has massive consequences. Massive consequences. You just want to think about what this war is all about. It's 2 armies standing toe-to-toe, trying to kill each other with massive amounts of firepower. And one side has a 5 to 1 or a 7 to 1 or a 10 to 1 advantage. The side that's on the lower end of that ratio is in the deep kimchi. This is really horrendous. And by the way, that country that's on the downside of that ratio in artillery also is on the downside in the population ratio. what do the casualties look like on both sides? Very hard to get numbers. If you press me, I could give you an estimate, but it would just be suggestive on what the actual numbers are. But let's just talk about what the casualty exchange ratio is likely to be. The Ukrainians often say, and it's reported frequently in the West, that 7 Russians die for every 1 Ukrainian. This is ludicrous. 7 Russians die for every 1 Ukrainian, given that artillery imbalance? This fails the common sense test. I think that the exchange ratio is more like 2 to 1. I think that 2 Ukrainians probably die for every 1 Russian. I have a number of friends who believe the number is higher. It's more like 3 to 1, maybe even 4 to 1. Again, just given those artillery figures, it's got to be 2 to 1 at least. So the Ukrainians are losing lots more people than the Russians are. Now, let me argue against myself, okay? One could say John's wrong, because what John is ignoring is that the Russians are on the offensive. As you all know, the Russians are the aggressor here. There's no question about that. It was Putin and company who invaded Ukraine. They are the aggressor. They are on the offensive. And as you know, offenders usually suffer 3 casualties for every 1 casualty that the defender suffers. This is the famous 3 to 1 rule of thumb. You need 3 attackers. You actually need more than 3 attackers, right, to overcome 1 defender on the battlefield, because the offender is out in the open and is exposed to fire, whereas the defender is down in a foxhole or down in a trench and is protected somewhat, okay? So the argument against me is that because the Russians are the aggressor or the offender, they should be suffering 3 casualties for every 1 that the Ukrainians suffer. There's 3 problems with this argument. The first is that the Ukrainians have been on the offense almost as much as the Russians have been. As I said to you before, 2022 was a very good year for the Ukrainians because they launched offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. And they were launching other offensives of a smaller nature in other places. People were talking about the Ukrainians' ability to engage in maneuver warfare. Okay? So if you look at the course of the war since February 24th, 2022, it's very difficult to make the argument that the Russians have been on the offensive more than the Ukrainians have been on the offensive. It looks like a wash to me. Another problem with this is if you look at the actual battles, places like Bakhmut, sort of other places where the Russians and the Ukrainians have really duked it out, what you discover is that the defender often counterattacks. And what that means is that the defender goes on the offense. So I spent a lot of time way back when studying Civil War battles and studying World War I battles. If you look at those battles and you look at who is the attacker and who is the defender, in some cases, this is true of Verdun, the offender actually suffers less casualties than the defender, right? And that's because the defender goes on the offense for defensive purposes. And the offender becomes the defender. And then the offender goes back on the offense, right? So you have this back and forth. Look at Civil War battles. You look at the 12 biggest Civil War battles. The casualty exchange ratios, regardless of who initiated the campaign, are basically 1 to 1 in a good number of those cases. It's really quite interesting. So it's very hard to say that in the battles that have been fought in Ukraine, that the Russians have been the attackers. And they therefore have suffered much greater casualties. Because even if they were initially the attackers, they morphed into defenders at different points, then went back to being offenders, and the same basic process was taking place on the Ukrainian side. And the end result is it's a wash. Third argument you want to keep in mind is that in the Western media, you see constant references to the Russians launching mindless frontal assaults or frontal attacks. Think of World War I, everybody getting up out of the trenches, charging across an open field and getting mowed down. And this is the picture that the media wants to give you of what the Ukrainians are facing when the Russians come at them. And of course, they're just mowing them down. And this is why there are 7 Russians dying for every 1 Ukrainian. This is a myth. It's just simply not true, right? This is not to say the Russians haven't launched a few frontal attacks here and there, but it's very clear from the news reports that the Russians have become much more sophisticated, and they're using their infantry in small packets to basically smoke out, figure out where Ukrainian forces are, and then pouring huge amounts of artillery on those forces. They're not engaging in frontal assaults. And amazingly, 10 minutes before I came down, I was looking at my iPhone, and the latest issue of The Economist came across. And this is one of the lead stories. Russia's tactics are improving, but Ukraine can still win. Russia's tactics are improving, but Ukraine can still win. See, what's happened here is that The Economist has got hold of a new report that's come out from the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, which I would suggest you all take a look at. It makes it very clear that the Russians are employing smart tactics. They're not employing frontal wave tactics. So the end result of this is that large numbers of Russians are not dying, right? There's no question Russians are dying, but they're not dying in anywhere near as large a number as the Ukrainians are. So I think 2 to 1 is a reasonable estimate, a casualty exchange ratio of 2 to 1. And I think when you marry that to the population size of Ukraine and the population size of Russia today, you can see what's going on in Ukraine. What exactly do I mean by that? It's quite clear that Ukraine is engaged, from their point of view, in a total war. They have mobilized their entire society. They have soldiers who are as old as all of us out there fighting. They have old dogs and young dogs, lots of untrained people. It's because they're desperate. It's because they're desperate. And they're also dragging people off the street, right? There are all sorts of stories about how they're out searching for young people who they can commandeer and put in the military. This is not the case with the Russians, right? In fact, lots of people, me included, wonder why the Russians haven't really mobilized their society in a larger way, right? And by the way, this big fight that just took place in Bakhmut, it's clear that the Ukrainians pushed large numbers of their best troops into Bakhmut to try and hold Bakhmut. It was not the Russian army, however, that was doing most of the fighting in Bakhmut. It was the Wagner group. There's this huge Russian army out there. Remember those 300,000 people they mobilized? And those people were mobilized on top of a foundation of soldiers that already were there. They have a lot of people. They have a lot of people in their military. But their mainline forces have not been fighting. The Ukrainian forces have been fighting the mainline forces. They tried like crazy to hang on to Bakhmut, and they couldn't do it, but it was with mainline forces. All right. All of this tells you why I think they're going to win. Now, let me conclude by talking about the possibility of peace agreement. Not going to be a peace agreement, meaningful peace agreement. Not going to happen. You'll get a frozen conflict. Why is there not going to be a meaningful peace agreement? Two main reasons. The first is the territory problem. The Ukrainians want their territory back. The Russians have made it clear they're not going to get their territory back. The Russians are not going to give up those 4 oblasts they annexed. They're not going to give up Crimea. And the Ukrainians insist on getting that back. Zelensky told Xi exactly this. There'll be no peace agreement until we get all our territory back. And the Russians are going to end up taking more territory. And they're not going to give that back either. How do you square that circle? Second big problem is the neutrality problem. The Russians insist that Ukraine be neutral. Right? They've insisted this from the beginning, and their argument is if Ukraine can't be neutral, they're going to wreck it. They're going to wreck it to keep it out of NATO, or if it's in NATO, it'll be ineffective because it's wrecked. Right? The Ukrainians, on the other hand, they don't want neutrality. The Ukrainians, for completely understandable reasons, want a security guarantee from someone. Well, there's the question of who is that someone? The only someone out there is the United States or the West or NATO. And that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen in ways that will please the Russians. The Russians will not accept that. So how do you square that circle? Right? You don't. Two other quick problems here. One is the hypernationalism problem. There's a lot of nationalism in the air before this war started. It's morphed into hypernationalism, which means the hatred on both sides is off the charts. It's going to make a peace agreement very difficult. And then the other problem is that a number of leaders have made it clear that they lied to Putin about their commitment to the Minsk agreement. You remember the Minsk agreement, which was formulated in late 2015, was designed to shut down the conflict in the Donbass, and Putin was deeply committed to making the Minsk agreement work because he did not want to invade Ukraine. Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, Petro Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself have all said they never had any interest in making Minsk work, and all they were doing was buying time to build up Ukraine so it would be in a better position to fight Russia. Trust? There's no trust on the Russian side because of this. So you see, you have a problem involving territory, a problem involving neutrality, hypernationalism, and zero trust. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. Let me conclude by just very briefly saying that what's remarkable about this case is that there were a significant number of people in the United States who argued that expanding NATO was going to lead to disaster. It included people like George Kennan. It included people like the actual Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Clinton administration, saying this was a disaster in the making. It included people like Paul Nitze and Jack Matlock, of course. There were a panoply of impressive intellects who said that this was a prescription for disaster. And you know what? They were right. And the end result is we are in this situation where enormous damage has already been done to Ukraine, most importantly, but to the West, to Russia, and to the United States. And with the passage of time, I'm sad to say, it's only going to get worse.